2 days can change the meaning of everything. In Washington, Alex Eala stood under the lights with the biggest trophy of her life. There were cameras. There were Philippine flags. There was history. Then the celebration ended. A flight waited. A hotel waited. A new tournament waited. And in Toronto, Alycia Parks waited. The score would eventually read 61-46-62. Alex Eala had won again. But the score alone does not explain why this match mattered. This was not simply the first round of another tournament. It was the first time EA stepped onto a court after becoming a WTA champion. The first time she played with a title beside her name. The first time every opponent could look across the net and see more than a dangerous young talent. Now they could see a target. Washington had changed the way the tennis world looked at her. In one remarkable week, Eala defeated Jung Chin-win, Leylah Fernandez, Elena Svitolina, Naomi Osaka, and Jessica Pegula. Each opponent demanded something different. Power, movement, patience, experience, composure. Eala found an answer every time. Then came the final against Pegula. The match stretched across 2 days because of the weather. Pegula won the first set. Eala returned, took the second, and then delivered a 6-love deciding set. It was the first WTA singles title of her career. It was also the first WTA singles title won by a player from the Philippines. That kind of victory can change a career. It can also make the next match more difficult. Most champions receive at least a little time to understand what they have achieved. Eala received a new schedule. There was recovery treatment. There was travel. There was media attention. There were new questions. There was a larger tournament. And there was an opponent who had already beaten her once that year. That last detail mattered most. Alycia Parks did not need to imagine how a match against Eala could turn. She had already lived through it. Months earlier in Melbourne, Eala had opened their match with almost complete control. 6-love. 4-1 set. Parks had no answer. Then the match changed. Parks won the second set. 6-3. She won the deciding set 6-2. Eala went from total control to defeat. Tennis players remember results like that. They remember the patterns. They remember the moments when pressure moved from one side of the net to the other. Most importantly, they remember that a comeback is possible. So when Eala raced through the opening set in Toronto, the crowd saw another brilliant start. Parks had reason to see something else. She had survived an even more difficult opening against the same opponent before that gave the match its first layer of tension. Eala was not facing someone who needed to discover a path back. She was facing someone who already believed that path existed. The second layer was physical. Washington had demanded almost everything from the final had been interrupted. The emotion had stretched across 2 days. The celebration had been followed by treatment, packing, travel, and preparation. A player can look sharp early in a match while adrenaline still carries part of the load. Then small signs of fatigue can appear. The legs recover a little more slowly. The decisions arrive a little later. The margin becomes thinner. Nothing needs to collapse. At this level, a small delay can be enough. The third layer was expectation. In Melbourne, Eala had been the rising player with a loud group of supporters behind her. In Toronto, she entered as the DC Open champion. That changed the emotional direction of the match. Before Washington, every major victory could feel like a breakthrough. After Washington, every difficult moment could be treated like a test. Was the title sustainable? Could she win when opponents prepared for her differently? Could she compete when the crowd expected her to win? Those questions were waiting before the first ball was struck. Toronto understood what Washington had created. The original court was no longer enough for the number of people who wanted to see her. The match was moved to a larger stage. Philippine flags filled the stands. Fans did not arrive only to discover whether Eala might become a champion. They came to see what the champion would do next. That support gave the night energy. It also made every difficult game feel larger. Eala could no longer disappear inside the role of the fearless outsider. She was the player everyone had come to watch. And across the net stood the player who had already turned one dominant Eala start into defeat. The first set belonged to Eala. 6-1. She controlled the early exchanges and moved through the set before Parks could settle. The crowd roared. The flags moved. For a moment, Toronto looked ready to continue the Washington celebration, but Parks did not disappear. She stayed close. She kept serving. She kept asking Eala to finish the match. Then the balance changed. Parks took the second set 6-4. Now the score carried a familiar shape. Melbourne had started with Eala winning 6-love. Toronto had started with Eala winning 6-1. In Melbourne, Parks responded in the second set. In Toronto, Parks responded again. The same opponent, the same early dominance, the same warning. But this time, Eala was not only carrying the memory of Melbourne. She was carrying the fatigue of Washington. She was carrying the attention of a larger crowd. She was carrying the expectations that arrive after a first title. The match was one set each. Everything that happened before had been reduced to one deciding set that moment. The trophy from Washington could not help her. The famous names she had defeated could not give her a point. The flags could not play the next rally. The only thing that mattered was the problem in front of her. Parks believed she could come back because she had done it before. Eala knew that belief existed. That is where the match became more than a result. The deciding set did not ask whether I could produce brilliant tennis. Washington had already answered that. It asked whether she could adjust after brilliant tennis stopped being enough. That is a different skill. In Melbourne, Eala had played a nearly perfect opening set. Then Parks changed the match. Eala spent the next two sets trying to regain the control that had already disappeared. That is one of the most dangerous traps. In tennis, a player can keep searching for a version of the match that no longer exists. The first plan worked. The opponent adapted. The rallies changed. The pressure changed. But the player continues looking backward. Toronto gave Eala the same danger. She could chase the feeling of the first set, or she could accept that the match had become something new. The opening set was over. She did not need to become the player who had dominated Parks. She needed to become the player who could survive after Parks responded. That was the real test. The match did not turn because one spectacular winner solved everything. There was no single point that erased the pressure. There was no magical moment that returned the match to the beginning. The change came through control. Not control of every rally, control of herself. The available evidence does not tell us every thought that passed through Eala at that moment. But the scoreboard shows the result of her response. She stopped the pattern. She regained command. She won the deciding set 62. The important point is not that the crowd created the victory. Crowds do not return serves. They do not recover tired legs. They do not make decisions under pressure, but they can change the emotional temperature of a match. Every cheer can remind a player what is at stake. Every quiet moment can feel sharper after a lost point. For Eala, the support represented pride, history, and expectation at the same time. That combination can lift a player when confidence is high. It can also become difficult when control begins to disappear. After Parks won the second set, Eala had to separate support from obligation. She could appreciate the crowd without trying to satisfy it on every point. She could recognize the memory of Melbourne without allowing that memory to decide Toronto. She could respect the title from Washington without playing as though one defeat would erase it. That emotional separation may have been the most important part of the deciding set. The score does not reveal every technical adjustment. It does reveal that EA regained enough stability to stop the comeback. She did not need another 6-love set. She did not need to dominate every exchange. She needed to win the next important point, then the next game, then the next opportunity. That is how difficult matches are often recovered. Not through one dramatic transformation, through a sequence of controlled decisions. The victory also protected Eala from a dangerous narrative. Had Parks completed another comeback, every discussion would have returned to Melbourne. People would have asked whether Eala struggled to close against the same opponent. They would have questioned the physical cost of Washington. They would have treated the loss as evidence that the title had left her empty. Eala prevented that story from taking control. She did not erase the questions surrounding her future. She answered the question that mattered that night. Could she respond when the old pattern returned? Yes. And she did it before the memory became momentum for Parks. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. In Melbourne, Parks won the third set 6-2. In Toronto, Eala won the third set 6-2. The numbers were identical. The meaning was completely reversed. One score represented the moment Parks completed the comeback. The other represented the moment Eala refused to allow the same ending twice. That was not revenge in the simplest sense. It was growth. Eala had been given the same type of problem. The same opponent, another dominant first set, another second set shift, another deciding set. This time she produced a different answer. That difference matters more than the drama of the final score. A title proves that a player can reach the highest point of 1 week. A match like this reveals what she does when the conditions become uncomfortable again. The fans in Toronto arrived ready to celebrate Washington. But Eala could not play as someone protecting a celebration. She had to play as someone still building. Point by point, the meaning of the crowd began to change. At the start, the noise belonged to the past. It belonged to the DC Open Trophy. It belonged to the victories over Jung, Fernandez, Svitolina, Osaka, and Pegula. By the end, the noise belonged to Toronto. Eala had given the crowd a new memory. She was no longer being carried by the championship story. She was adding another chapter to it. That is important because the first match after a breakthrough can expose a player. The emotions are different. The expectations are different. The opponent prepares differently. You are no longer the surprise. You are the result everyone wants to challenge. Parks challenged it. She took the second set. She reopened the memory of Melbourne. She placed Eala inside the same kind of deciding set that had ended badly before. Then Eala changed the ending. 6-2. Not because the pressure disappeared. Because she played through it. Not because Melbourne was forgotten. Because the lesson remained useful. Not because Washington made her untouchable. Because Washington had given her evidence that she could stay composed when a match became difficult. That may be one of the clearest signs of development in tennis. Growth does not always mean avoiding an old problem. Sometimes it means recognizing the problem earlier. It does not mean pretending the past never happened. It means refusing to obey it. When the final point ended, Toronto had not simply watched the DC Open champion survive her next match. It had watched her solve a problem that had followed her from Melbourne. One corrected ending does not prove that every weakness is gone, but it can reveal a pattern. And the larger pattern around EA is becoming difficult to ignore. One victory can be called an upset. One tournament can be called a magical week, but when the same player continues answering different questions on different courts, surprise stops being a complete explanation. Wimbledon asked whether I could handle a historic stage. Across the net stood a defending champion, one of the most accomplished players of her generation. Eala had never reached the fourth round of a Grand Slam. No player from the Philippines had done it. Then Eala won 76-62. The result mattered because of the name across the net, but it also mattered because of the scale of the moment. Grand Slam pressure changes everything. The cameras remain longer. The crowd reacts to every point. The history of the tournament seems to surround the court. Eala did not play like someone asking permission to belong. She played like someone who believed the opportunity was hers. Washington asked a different question. Could she survive several elite opponents in the same week? Yung Chin Win brought power. Leylah Fernandez brought movement and the confidence of a defending champion. Alina Svitolina brought experience and discipline. Naomi Osaka brought 4 Grand Slam titles and a history of hard-court dominance. Jessica Pegula brought final pressure, home support, and the ranking of a world number 3. Al did not solve one problem 5 times. She solved 5 different problems. Then Toronto asked something Washington could not. Could she live like a champion? That question may sound less dramatic than beating Osaka or Pegula. It is not. The first title changes the way a player is introduced. It changes the way opponents prepare. It changes the questions from reporters. It changes the reaction of the crowd. Most importantly, it changes the internal challenge. Before a title, a difficult match can feel like an opportunity. After a title, the same match can feel like something that must be defended. That is where players can become trapped. They start protecting the breakthrough instead of continuing the process that created it. Ella had almost no time to fall into that trap. Washington ended. Toronto began. There was a new city, a new hotel, a different court, a bigger tournament. The Canadian Open offered a deeper field and a larger reward. The first opponent was not a stranger. It was Parks, the player who represented an unresolved problem. That made Toronto the perfect test. Not because Parks was the biggest name Eala had faced. Because Parks knew how to hurt her. Eala won the first set 6-1. Parks won the second 6-4. The old danger returned. Then EA won the third 6-2. Same opponent, same type of match, opposite ending. That is often how development appears, not as a completely new situation, as an old situation handled differently. Wimbledon showed that EA could rise to a historic stage. Washington showed that she could survive a brutal series of opponents. Toronto showed that she could carry success into the next tournament without becoming trapped by it. 3 events, 3 different demands, 1 growing pattern. Eala is becoming harder to define with one strength. She can attack. She can absorb pressure. She can respond after losing control. She can play as the outsider. She can also play as the player everyone came to see. That final role may become one of the greatest challenges of her career. The demand for her Toronto match exceeded the space originally prepared for it. Fans did not arrive only because they were curious. They arrived because Washington had changed their expectations. Philippine flags were no longer appearing around a promising young player. They were appearing around a champion. Attention like that can become heavy. In Toronto, Eala turned it into energy. That is why the victory over Parks means more than one place in the next round. Eala did not need another famous upset to prove something. She needed to handle the ordinary work that follows an extraordinary moment. She needed to wake up after history and compete again. She needed to accept that the tour would not pause while she celebrated. She needed to face an opponent who understood how to challenge her. Then she needed to solve the problem in real time. That is what champions eventually learn to do. They do not play perfectly every week. They do not dominate every set. They do not avoid every dangerous moment. They learn how to keep moving when the easy version of the match disappears. Washington gave the trophy. Toronto gave her confirmation. But confirmation is not completion. The field becomes more difficult from here. The scouting becomes deeper. The expectations become louder. The next question is no longer whether Eala can create one unforgettable week. The next question is how far she can go now that the surprise is over. Toronto did not come only to congratulate the DC Open champion. It came to discover what she would do next. 3 sets later, Eala had given an answer. Could she return to elite competition only days after the biggest moment of her career? Could she carry physical fatigue, emotional weight, and the expectations of thousands of people without losing the fearless tennis that produced the Washington title? Yes, But not because the match was easy. Not because every part of her game worked perfectly. Not because Parks allowed the celebration to continue. Eala won because the conditions became uncomfortable and she continued anyway. She changed cities. She entered a bigger tournament. She faced an opponent who had already beaten her. She watched a dominant first set disappear. She felt the match begin to follow a familiar path. Then she changed the ending. That is what Toronto revealed. Washington showed that Eala could reach the highest point of one unforgettable week. Toronto showed that she could wake up after history and begin working again. That may be the more important skill. Trophies are won during extraordinary moments. Careers are built during the ordinary days that follow them. The flights, the recovery sessions, the unfamiliar hotel rooms, the early practices, the difficult matches when the body is tired and the crowd expects another celebration. Eala did not have perfect conditions. She did not need them. The supporters in Toronto arrived to honor what she had achieved in Washington. By the end of the match, they were no longer celebrating only the past. They were watching the future. They saw a player who could carry the attention of a growing audience. They saw a player who could lose control of a match without losing control of herself. They saw a player who could meet an old problem and produce a new answer. For the Philippines, the Washington title was history. Toronto offered something different. It offered evidence that history may not be the conclusion. It may be the opening chapter. The challenges will become harder. Opponents will study Eala more carefully. Every tournament will carry greater expectations. The surprise is over. Now comes the part where Eala must prove that she can remain dangerous when everyone knows she is coming. Canadian Open, Cincinnati, US Open. Each new court will ask a different question. How strong is her recovery? How well can she handle pressure? Can she continue winning when the crowd expects it? Can she turn this run into something that lasts? Washington gave Alex Eala her first WTA trophy. Toronto gave the first proof that she may be ready to carry everything that comes with it. So, what impressed you most? The championship run in Washington? The response after losing the second set against Parks, or the demand that moved her Toronto match to a larger court? Tell us below and subscribe to follow the next answer, because Alex Eala has already shown that the most important match is not always the one that makes history. Sometimes it is the one that proves history is only